It is a great pleasure for me to be moderating this discussion. I am Jana Dreyer, the founder and editor of Borderlegs, a news and analysis website on international trade policy focused on Europe. So what Brussels is doing, London after Brexit, and what's happening at the World Trade Organization. That's what we focus on most of the time. So we will, 1 hour and a half, have a conversation on a really big major topic, the Second Tariff War, and its consequences for the international trade regime. We have with us very eminent speakers who will give us a view from around the world and also different angles on this theme. We have James Tuo-Gatti, who is professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. We have Simon Schropp, who is a director at the Berkeley Research Group. We have Anna Jerzewska, who is founder of Trade and Borders, a consultancy specialized in customs matters. And last but not least, Joel Trachtman at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So during these 1.5 hours, we'll be taking stock of the tariff war unleashed by the second Trump administration. We will assess its consequences for the economy, for businesses, but mostly also for the system, the multilateral trading system, and everything that goes with it, under which we've been operating for the last 30, if not 80 years, depending how you count. So maybe I'll start with you, Joel. Tell us a little bit what the current situation is now with the United States tariffs. It is quite confusing. We had first announcements on, restoration of steel and aluminum tariffs, then the big proclamations on the 2nd of April on reciprocal tariffs, tariffs on Canada, tariffs on China, tariffs on Mexico, and then a walk back, the end of de minimis for China, and then the rest of the world. We don't know. Where are we right now? Can you give us a little bit of picture and also maybe of where we are, and also with it the decision making in the United States at the moment on this question? Joel, I don't seem to hear you.
Sorry, thank you. As you suggest, Jana, it's tremendously complicated, which of course is a trade barrier in itself, and we could take lots of time to go through the ins and outs. And of course, one of the things that's going on domestically is that the president is acting unilaterally, and he's acting unilaterally in what I consider a rather disorganized and wanton way. He seems to believe in unlimited United States terms of trade power. I think that's incorrect. He believes that other states lack agency, that the United States can act by diktat and simply say, here's what we're going to do without worrying about what other states will do. There are cooler heads in the administration. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, says America first doesn't mean America alone. That's our crazy rhetoric, but at least it recognizes that there's a world out there to deal with, and United States exporters and importantly, United States importers are concerned about all of this. So, we have a bunch of statutes. Actually, one of the constitutional problems in the United States is that while our Commerce Clause of our Constitution specifies that full power over tariffs is in the hands of Congress, Congress has delegated authority under a number of statutes to the president. And the foreign relations law problem is that our courts are reluctant to review the factual basis for the exercise of that authority. That authority always has some conditions.
Yeah.
There's great deference to the president in establishing those conditions. Interestingly, under recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, the Loper-Bright case a couple of years ago, there's less judicial deference to executive interpretations of statutes, but still deference to factual determinations. The line between those two things, those two legal activities, is somewhat unclear, I think, and so that will be a question. But the main statute at issue now is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act under a security pretext domestically. If you were defending the United States internationally, you might argue a security pretext that would be less likely to succeed. But because of this limited judicial review, those tariffs, while they're being challenged by 20 states and by several companies, they may persist. And as you suggested, there's a kind of a patchwork for Canada and Mexico and China. The pretext was drugs, and for Canada and Mexico, illegal immigration. Then for Canada and Mexico, goods covered by the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement were exempted. We've got these worldwide, quote, reciprocal, there's very little reciprocal about them, tariffs that are now at a base of 10%. For the larger tariff, there's a 90-day delay for, quote, deals, except for China. China's subject to the 145% tariff for most goods. There have been exceptions for electronics. And then Europe's subject to the 10% basic tariff, and under Section 232 of the 1962 Act, a security-focused statute, steel, aluminums, and autos are covered with extra tariffs. And then there are investigations going on copper, rare earths, semiconductors, timber of all things, pharmaceuticals, and trucks. So there's a lot going on, and I'm not sure that things will be stable at any level. It's possible. The last thing I'll say is, while those domestic legal actions could be successful, you can read the complaint by the states. It's plausible. There's also domestic politics, and you might ask, we always like to attack the title of our own panels. Is it a war when you're attacking yourself? Because in economics terms, the United States is doing self-harm. In the Tariff War 1.0 under Trump's first administration, some scholarly economics empirical research suggested that 95% of the incidence of those tariffs fell on United States consumers. And it's a regressive tax on United States consumers with the cost of imports, but also the cost of domestically produced goods rising as domestic producers take advantage of the extra protection. It impairs United States manufacturing. One thing, the old trade didn't anticipate was supply chain manufacturing, and so tariffs are even more self-harm than they were in the past. And then there is retaliation on the table from China already, but perhaps beginning in July from Europe and other states. And that retaliation may cause some retrenchment. I'll just note there the Europeans, Sabine Weyand, I think is in Washington now for discussions, Scott Bessent, and the United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer are going to, I think, Geneva on Wednesday, somewhere in Switzerland, to meet with the Chinese vice premier. But, it takes a long time to make deals, so we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very good transition to James. Can you take us a little bit around the world, James, on how the rest of the world basically has reacted to it? Whatever you want to say about what's happening in Europe, Asia, Africa, anywhere else in the world, Middle East. How's the world reacting to this? Is it doing what the Trump administration wants it to do, so negotiate and capitulate, or what's going on? And
yeah, thanks, Iana, and thanks to SIEL for inviting me to join these panelists. I think, as Joel has already alluded to, the reaction has been sharply critical around the world, not just because of the norm-breaking behavior of the tariffs within the multilateral trading system, but because of the huge costs and disruptions on businesses, farmers, consumers that the tariffs have caused. So if you look at a more granular level, the types of response you see are a reflection of a combination of factors. The relative market power of the US versus those countries that have been targeted, as well as the regions, but also the variety of strategies that they have decided to pursue in response. In very broad strokes, and this is sort of like, at like 10,000 feet or more, to just for purposes of discussion, I would say that there are three main types of responses that we have seen. So China, which many people argue and believe was the primary target of this action, it's sort of, as Joel has already alluded to, retaliated with its own tariffs, and until now, perhaps until next week, it has been silent towards in the face of these tariffs. A second strategy has been a preference for negotiations instead of another tariff or trade war. And the EU, which initially also had some countermeasures with aluminum and steel tariffs, decided to suspend those as well, to pursue negotiations. And I would say that other countries like Japan, India, Canada, the UK have preferred negotiations, perhaps preferably in the Oval Office, something like that. And then a third strategy, some countries, large countries of the global south, they've agreed to work together to strengthen trade amongst themselves as a counterweight to the tariffs. So you see with, Brazil and Mexico, ASEAN, sort of in the African region, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreements have been recent meetings, all of them seeking to pursue long-term strategies, including trade integration, that look beyond the political cycles of what happens in Washington. And then finally, the category, I'll just put it, everybody else who we've been told have been calling the White House or Washington to make deals with the US. And some of them already making written offers, as the USTR has noted. So just to dig a little deeper in the sort of four ways sort of response, so as I said, I think China seems to have been one of the primary motivations behind these tariffs. I mean, I certainly think that there's a very important geopolitical dimension here that is not just in the trade context, but as the Chinese economy has really grown. And I think that part of the reason that China has been silent and retaliated is because obviously it has economic leverage and market power that many other countries don't have. It can afford silence. It can afford to drag out negotiations. And maybe even up to the midterm elections, who knows, to see what happens. Not many countries can afford that kind of a response. For example, the last category of countries that I alluded to, some people might argue have capitulated by sort of already offering zero tariffs in response to these tariffs. And I think China did not want to invite further blackmail by immediately sort of beginning to call some, the red phone in their Oval Office or something like that. And obviously, Beijing is interested in winning the symbolic battle by not caving in to US demands. I just want to note also that there's at least one or two WTO cases that China has brought in the WTO, and those are at consultation stage. So for the countries that are preferring negotiations and also building a new order to offer predictability and certainty outside, without the US, I think the EU sort of has been leading this call. And I think that's an important development. It is one also shared by many countries in the global south, of both strengthening trade within themselves, but also building something outside of the United States. I think even while the EU has preferred negotiations, it is also been considering a new anti-coercion instrument that confers broad power to retaliate against economic coercion through restrictions on trading goods, services, foreign investment, market access, IP, financial services. So certainly this is likely to be a very big shift. Perhaps the trade regime might begin looking like the international investment regime of a few decades ago, when we had those types of battles within the international investment regime. And I think that it's important to pay attention in this discussion about the efforts in various regions to diversify trade partnerships that avoid the United States. The EU has argued one of the primary reasons for this is that its own trade the US represents only 13% of global trade. And the 87% of global trade is with other countries, other than the United States. So it's likely that there is some leverage that other countries might have, given that these realignments that might be being forged both by sort of the big Western countries, but also in the global South, suggests that the unilateral authority of the US is unlikely to have the kinds of consequences, whatever those might be, because the goals are very unclear, that the White House would like to have. So just to end, I think with the last category of countries that are unilaterally lowering their tariffs, or at least announcing written offers, as we have had, for example, Vietnam to lower tariffs on American cars, ethanol, and LNG. And many countries, apparently dozens, that have done so and are engaged or are in the process of talks, perhaps even some moving to a technical level. Many of them have avoided hitting back, like China. They just don't have the leverage to do so. And many of them, I think, are being driven by specific interests within those countries that would like to continue having access to the US markets. Just one interesting tidbit here is that some countries that are not playing to the US's tariff wars, by making tariff offers or showing, are beginning to show divided loyalties. So Kenya is a very good example. The US Secretary of State was supposed to go to Kenya about a week and a half ago, but at the same time, when he was supposed to be there, the Kenyan president was in China, as part of this realignment, and the U.S. Secretary of State decided to not to visit Kenya. So you're seeing all sorts of interesting things. So this is not just about trade. There are lots of other things that are going on.
Yeah, the ramifications are broader
Yes,
than trade
yes. And just a
manifesting.
final
Yeah.
example, some countries like the
Mm.
Democratic Republic of Congo are trying to get attention by offering critical minerals, Lesotho by getting a deal with Starlinks for their satellite
Mm.
network there. So, yeah, so thank you.
Going to be very interesting, the broader geopolitical realignment that might be resulting on it. But that's a bit beyond the remit of this specific panel. Simon, now a little bit more to the economic impact that you see right now, sort of short term. Do you have any views, data analysis to offer, and maybe a bit more the longer term consequences as well? In this world of supply chains that we are in, that has been already alluded to by Joel.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. Let's take a snapshot, the here and now,
Yeah.
and then let's look at the future. Let's say the next six to 18 months. Okay, let's start with a snapshot, and let's start with the U.S. Because it is the epicenter, from which the impact ripples out in both in space and time. I think people have read in the news that the U.S. GDP shrank in the first quarter of 2025 by 0.3% quarter on quarter, and is expected to perform below expectation and anticipations, and doesn't take an economist to see that that's not good. Interestingly, I guess the U.S. trade deficit hit at the same time a record high. That is driven by goods imports and the goods deficit. If you think about that, not that surprising, because countries importers are stocking up to beat the tariffs. So that would explain it. Service exports of the U.S. remain strong, and there's a service surplus. Tourism is a little bit down. Maybe a word on investment. So essentially, to what degree do we already see reshoring and friendshoring in the U.S.? And let me respond to this with a maybe provocative counter questions. Who wants to reshore when the imported inputs cost a fortune, and the value chain can change overnight into and go into the United States? And as to friendshoring, who exactly are the United States friends right now? It's hard to really figure out in that climate right now. In general, it's really the uncertainty that's toxic for any market expansion or investment. So we really do see, I think, right now a depressed investment climate. So how does this right now affect the rest of the world? And James, I think, has given a pretty good summary of what the camps are that I would call the team fight, team appease, and team wait and see. Not going to go into detail there, but team fight, China, arguably Canada. I think the point there is that they are actually willing to suffer consequences and are actively pursuing alternatives right now, or alternative trade routes to the US, and that's the issue of transshipments going through other countries. The other countries that sort of appease, wait and see, my feeling is that they are in a holding pattern, and maybe sort of preparing internally for the looming trade diversion that's coming when the US closes its market down and cheaper goods are flooding the areas like the EU. Looking into the future, or the short to medium term future, I guess my main message is we ain't seen nothing yet. So this is just about starting. We're the real effects are on the bend. Let's look at the US. I think once the warehouse stocks are depleted, and with a back to school and Christmas purchases around the bend, prices are going to rise and consumer confidence is going to drop. Two scenarios to my mind, how that will then sort of what reactions this will trigger. Scenario number one, the US drops the tariffs, including China tariffs, once the approval ratings have dropped with it. This appears to be the bet that the stock market is taking right now, and some White House insiders also have mentioned that. The economic effects of the US dropping the tariffs are obviously smaller than the alternative I'll talk to in a minute, but they're still non-trivial. Just think of just two concerns. The US non-tariff barriers remain, and Joel has spoken to this a little bit. Just as an example, the US has imposed additional fees on Chinese shipping companies. That is something that you'll have to overcome even in that scenario. And the sort of the intermittent period between now and the US potentially dropping the tariffs may be enough to cause a sort of pandemic-style backlog in shipping, port clearing, manufacturing. You can't just switch on manufacturing like this, even in China. So this is scenario number one. Scenario number two is a continuation of some of the tariffs and the sort of bilateral tit-for-tat deal making. My sense of that is this scenario will calcify the uncertainty. And again, uncertainty is really what companies hate most, because there's no predictability in tariff action, and you can't do risk management properly. So in this case, I would think the US economy will take a dive, and obviously particularly if companies start retaliating. And there we're not talking just goods. We could also be talking retaliation against services, US services, against US IP. So that could be relatively bad. And along with the US, the rest of the world will suffer. Obviously, we'll suffer more in scenario two when a continuation of where we are right now. James has mentioned. And actually, let me leave it here. Let me leave it here, and let's go to the best in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Anna, you've been on the forefront of this uncertainty, if not chaos, because these were overnight proclamations. What have we seen in terms of what's happening on the border? How has it impacted firms operating in the US? Short term, do you already see long-term realignment? What do you report from what you see on the ground there?
Thank you so much, Iana, and thanks everyone. Great to be here with you. And yes, what do we see in the trenches? I'll pick up of what Simon was talking about, the uncertainty, and try to provide a bit of an overview of what's happening. This has, of course, had a profound impact on companies, both in the US and everywhere else. And as Simon mentioned, there is this sense of this is just the beginning. We have 3.5 years of this left, if not almost 4 years of this left. So there is this sense in the private sector that this is something that we'll have to live with. When we talk about impact on companies or on firms, I just wanted to point out that it's not just the traders. So the traders are obviously impacted, so companies importing, exporting. But it's also customs, as in customs professionals, both customs authorities in the US and in other countries, customs professionals, and then we have the logistics industry, which again, as Simon mentioned as well, that this has a massive impact on the logistics industry. We've talked about, or we've heard about the situation in US ports. We are also hearing reports around the impact of the removal of the Minimus on the aviation industry, on the transport, and so on. So it's not just importers and exporters. Another thing that kind of is perhaps worth mentioning is that this is just one of many things happening in trade. And I know it seems obvious, but it is helpful to remind everyone that it's just, there's so many other issues going on. We're still in the post-pandemic kind of adjustment period. We've got wars, we've got mounting geopolitical tensions, we've got sanctions, tariffs, protectionism. In the EU, we've got Green Deal, we've got overall, I think globally, this increased pressure on companies when it comes to supply chain visibility and transparency. So in January, there was no one in the industry, in the trade and customs industry, with nothing to do. There was no spare capacity in the industry. So this is all on top. This is a massive disruption on top of everything else that the industry is currently dealing with, and that by itself is a disruption. It's a massive disruption, and this uncertainty that Simon mentioned is definitely felt. It's also in the way these tariffs are applied. Is this kind of, you know, almost a political circus reality TV style way of conducting trade policy that has not been appreciated by the private sector. This is not, or by the customs officials. This is not what we are familiar with, and this is not what we like. When we apply tariffs or any other trade measures or change anything in terms of what we do at the border, what generally tends to happen is that you announce the policy and you give the industry a bit of time to prepare. And there's a lot to do for in terms of companies that need to prepare their supply chains and need to prepare paperwork and information and so on. But also for the customs officials, they need to put codes in the tariff and the IT systems to make sure that things work, that the tariffs can be applied and so on. They need to issue practical guidance to explain to companies, because obviously the executive orders are quite high level. But on the ground, we need to know what do you want, which code do you want in which box? So someone needs to translate the policy into practical terms. When you do it with 2 days notice, you don't have that time, and you are causing your own customs authorities, so CBP, to be quite stressed and overwhelmed. So I think one of the impact on the private sector was that we did not get this time to prepare. So when it was, and then of course some of these tariffs were walked back and cancelled or revoked and so on. But we didn't get practical guidance. We had several issues of IT systems not being ready and goods that have been previously subject to tariffs and then were exempt from tariffs were still being charged tariffs because the IT systems didn't keep up with the policy, basically. So things like this obviously are not particularly helpful. Another thing that's not very helpful is that each of those executive orders has a different list of obviously products and exemptions, but also timelines, details. Some of them allowed for drawback, some of them do not, some of them add up, some of them do not. So in reality, it's not just tariffs. It's you literally as a company have to read every single executive order separately and understand what is possible, what's not possible. Because the questions that you get from the industry isn't, what's the percentage of the tariff? It's what happens if my ship is here and this happens and at this time this happens. So the supply chains are so much more complex than the executive orders. So that's not helpful. I mentioned this lack of capacity. I mean, I basically feel like I haven't really done much since the end of January other than keeping up with these tariffs. And I can only imagine what professional, I don't have to imagine because I actually talk to them on a daily basis, but people who work for a company and have actual day jobs and things that they need to do for the company to operate, they don't have capacity or time to keep up with these things. And, quite a lot of companies had to resort to getting external help and obviously paying for that external help, which again, not very helpful. Another point is the understanding for a lot of companies that are not US based, they still have to play by US rules. So 2 examples here. One is around where this product comes from. When we had on the 2nd of April, those liberation reciprocal tariffs, and they were for a split second different for different countries. The big question was, what tariff applies to my product if it's manufactured in 4 or 5 different countries? That obviously depends on rules of origin, but on the US understanding of rules of origin. We also had a couple of the tariffs with steel, aluminium, the reciprocal ones, some other ones, where you could discount or reduce the amount of tariff by calculating US content. And you didn't have to pay tariffs on the part of your product that was US originating. Again, that's something that the supplier in a foreign country needs to provide this information, needs to know how to do. That's not simple for companies that are not used to, the US way of doing things around customs. So this all resorted, and this quite a few examples of how difficult that is for companies, but this all kind of led to a range of very creative solutions around how to minimize tariffs, and a lot of accounting companies, both US-based and non-US based, providing suggestions or solutions that some are within the legal boundaries, some are maybe slightly outside or in the gray area of how to minimize your bill, and some of them are really just, you know, scraping the bottom of the barrel, trying to separate royalties from the value to see if we can minimize this a little bit. But a lot of companies also found that following this type of advice leads to non-compliance, and then obviously once you get in trouble with CBP or any other customs authorities, you will feel the consequences of this for a good few years. So that is maybe like the last point to mention here, is that in terms of the impact on the industry, when it comes to making decisions based on what is happening, and I think Simon mentioned this, the time scales for investment decisions, should we move to the US, should we change our supply chains, are completely different than these policy shifts. This is you know, something that companies plan years in advance, and it's not possible, it's not doable in any way to shift your supply chain overnight just because the tariffs are in place. And also, given the lack of stability and the lack of kind of all the points we've discussed around what's likely to happen going forward, why would you move your supply chains? Why would you try to adjust your business operations to something that's so volatile and so uncertain? So this is a bit of a snapshot of how things are going. Needless to say, they're not going very well. And it will be very interesting to see what happens when the warehouses empty out and reality starts hitting.
Okay, let's see, but let's move up from the warehouses to the system. Simon, where does this new presidency leave the WTO-centric trading system? Where do you see it going, basically?
Where does it leave the WTO-centric trading system? So with the caveat that forecasts are generally difficult, particularly those that concern the future, let me chart out like 3 alternative scenarios that I see where this is going from least to most likely. Scenario number 1, we will see a profound WTO reform with the US at its center. So US is re-engaging and, you know, wanting to have center stage. There's, to my mind, no way of knowing what the reforms would look like and how profound they're going to be. But what I can probably say that they definitely would involve defanging of the dispute settlement system, some clarification on emergency opt-outs, which the Trump administration is very keen on right now. And if I were a betting man, revocation of consensus voting. In all likelihood, I think the WTO would come out much, much weaker. Which leads obviously to the question, what jumps into the breach there? And let me get back to that in a second. Scenario number 2, the WTO continues without the US. So either the US quits the WTO or sees its membership suspended, the voting rights suspended because, for example, they're not paying their dues, which is actually the case. I think you would still see a profound reform of the WTO in all its 3 core functions: negotiation, dispute settlement, and transparency and monitoring. Just highlighting a few that I think would have to happen when it comes to negotiation. The Doha round would need to be declared dead, and as would probably be the ambition of a single undertaking, because that has just been too heavy a lift for the last 18, 19 years. 20 years, anyway. An end of consensus decision making, or a revitalization of the GATT era don't obey, don't object principle. So, you know, i.e. stay in your lane if it doesn't concern you that much, kind of thing. And the WTO would need to allow new ways of contracting for those countries who are willing to liberalize more. And have that do that within the confines of the WTO agreement. So we're talking critical mass agreements, open plurilateral, joint statement initiatives. All of that is typically understood as under the heading of the WTO of different speeds. So I think those things would need to happen along with other things in the negotiation sphere. In the dispute settlement sphere, it will all need to start with a reinstatement of the appellate body, and with a reform of the dispute settlement system as we see it right now. Would start with having to dial back on the sort of the legalization of panels, or the judicial activism, and maybe the role of the secretariat, and other things. In terms of transparency, maybe that's wishful thinking, but I would think that the membership would need to empower the secretariat more to engage in like serious monitoring and analysis and evaluation. Off to the third scenario then, which I think is the most likely, is that the WTO is a lame duck, and countries move on to mega regionals. And I think there the coalition of the willing, i.e. those that want to continue a rule-based international order, the obvious candidate to me is CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, plus EU, plus UK, and maybe India. So that's not exactly a greenfield operation. It's good. And they could maybe actually make the changes, for example, in the dispute settlement system. The big question here is this going to be with or without China? With China, you have 80% of world trade, so that's a big chunk. Without China, you're missing two of the biggest economies of the world. So each alternative brings with it its own geopolitical side effects, which I think we can discuss later on. But that's I think the most likely scenario where we see that system going.
Okay, thank you very much. That sets a good scene here and helps us think about it. Joel, can you dive deeper into the responses of some of the larger trading powers here with their systemic impact? So how do you assess the responses of the EU, of China, others like Japan and etc.? I mean, this is about maybe or maybe not salvaging what is left of sort of rules-based trade, a global level playing field based on WTO rules. I mean, what's your assessment of their responses? What should they do to salvage, if not improve, a rules-based system, if at all?
Right.
Sort of more. Your advice, please.
Well, one thinks immediately of rocks and harbors, and the United States is the rogue or crazy country that is dropping rocks into its harbors. And I think Simon said other countries can fight, appease, or wait and see. I think most countries are sober and professional enough to realize that dropping rocks in their harbors in retaliation is not a good strategy. But as an academic, one starts to think about game theory and how do you describe this strategic moment? If retaliation can bring the opponent to terms quickly without too much of that economic harm from your own retaliation, maybe you try it. Otherwise, as James suggested, there's a preference for negotiations, avoiding self-harm through retaliation, strategic patience, which seems to be the European strategy for now, although I know they've just said Boeing and there may be other targets that they would start to threaten to kind of precipitate lobbying in the United States, which Apple did successfully. And it shades into corruption in the United States because Trump can use these tariff exceptions to cause people to change their policy. So I just recently heard that Trump said that he wanted his administration to be every day like a reality TV show with a daily victory. And I think if I were China or Europe or Vietnam, I would say, how can I offer him a daily victory that he can announce that will not be costly to me? Because he actually doesn't care about real things. He cares about how things look. So then that seems to be the strategy. And if we're talking about real things, though, I think Simon described some realistic possibilities. There could be zero for zero free trade agreements, as have been offered, that involves avoiding, reciprocal on-foot shooting. We could see managed trade, as in the first tariff war with China. The United States has shown itself under Trump to be an unreliable partner. So you can't really make long-term deals. But just turning to the possible future of the trade system, one thinks of Churchill's idea of never wasting a good crisis. This is, the trade system is, at least the WTO system, is 30 years old, and it has a lot of gaps and problems. And one of those, there's always a kernel of reality in some of the things Trump is doing. And that kernel of reality, I think, is the inability to really digest China's membership in the WTO. So some level of real renegotiation at the multilateral level, zero for zero kinds of things, a free trade agreement with the world except China. Trump talks about negotiation over non-tariff barriers. That's something that he nixed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that he took the United States out of negotiations for. There might have been something in the CPTPP that involves really hard work, which this administration does not seem prepared for. And a WTO renaissance might involve, as I say, a revised system to manage China trade. I've been working on an agenda for incorporating sustainable development more deeply into the trade system. It would involve that, addressing e-commerce, services. Some of those things should be done multilaterally. Certainly tariffs are better done multilaterally. But as Simon said, there's room for a WTO of multiple speeds, and that might be a way to move forward. I think the WTO is ready for reform. We should embrace WTO reform, but it may be that some of these things happen regionally, that we see mega regionals rise. I hope that the world will tend towards economic efficiency rather than splintering too extensively. But it's hard to say how things will move forward. And the one thing I'll close with is this administration seems woefully unprepared for real professional negotiations. It doesn't seem to have the capacity to sustain real negotiations that would address these issues in depth. Thank you.
We'll see. Okay, that was a good overview, some hope, but also some realism. James, let's focus now on the African continent. One of it because I find the media in the West have not talked enough about the consequences of it. I mean, some of the countries were highest hit with the initial sort of reciprocal tariffs. I mean, there was the little emotion around Lesotho, but there are others as well. That comes generally on the backdrop where AGOA and all these unilateral preferences are not getting renewed and things like that. And then you say there is among the global South attempts to boost trade, but seeing it from Europe, I've seen little in Europe in terms of actually helping, some of the developing countries that might be very badly affected, go through this crisis. Can you update us a little bit more on where things are going from a sort of a sub-Saharan African perspective?
Yeah, so thank you. I think that the first challenge, I guess, the Trump administration faces this year is that in September, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act will come to an end. And it either will expire or get renewed. But in this climate, your guess is as good as mine what would happen. I think my concern is that, this is a regime like many others. We're just talking about the African Growth and Opportunity Act, but there are other preferential regimes for other regions, the Caribbean and so on and so forth, and the South Pacific. But I think preferential regimes have had bipartisan support and have been renewed, at least AGOA, since 2000. So if it's not renewed in 2025, it would be the first time that the US would end this commitment to what I think is a really important program. Again, to invoke countries like Lesotho, it's very important for employment. Those industries that bring exports into the U.S. on a preferential basis under AGOA, under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, in industries like textiles and apparels, is a really important economic benefit to those countries. And I'm sure, as everybody knows, that the U.S. International Trade Commission does extensive studies on the impact of these programs before they are authorized, and monitors them on a year-to-year basis. And there are lots of conditions that must be met. So it's not really free lunch as such. So I would say, I think this is sort of one of the big stakes to watch this year. I think the tariffs don't make this any better, because obviously the tariffs completely ignored these preferential regimes. And we're not even talking about the GSP schemes, which are completely separate and which Congress has in the past been unable to renew. Now, I think preferential regimes are not just important from the sort of bilateral relationships that the US has with countries that are eligible for these programs, but because they are a key part of the global trading system. They were very hard fought for in the 1960s and in the 1970s because developing countries, when they joined this system was not constructed with these developing countries. These developing countries joined a system already in place, and they argued because of their small share of global trade, the rules needed to be adjusted to accommodate them with these preferential regimes, or whatever you might want to call them, special and differential treatment. But these are not legally binding, but are really consequential, as I said, and I hope that they remain a key feature of the global trading system, with or without the US. I think for other countries other than the United States, I think being in solidarity with the countries of the global South is very important. For example, China has, in the recent past, not in response to these tariffs, also opened up its markets on a duty-free, quota-free basis for a number of African countries. And I think those types of deals are really important for the reasons that I've already mentioned. But also, I think that countries like China, the EU, could also be in solidarity with countries in the global South, so that they don't acquiesce to US demands to protect genetically modified products such as corn that are likely to decimate local agriculture, displace thousands of farmers, and biodiversity, as we know, happened in Mexico under NAFTA. And that's just one example. There are many other types of bad deals that could be made under the gun in this 90-day period, or whatever period, that attack and reverse climate, health, and digital regulation. Those are huge risks for countries in the global South. And so especially in an era where we also have seen the withdrawal of other types of aid, like USAID does not exist anymore, the more reason to be concerned about those things. We're already seeing the consequences of the drawback of USAID. And then I think another key objective that could be part of the new discussions is to support regional integration efforts in Africa, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the global South by investing in industrial and manufacturing sectors there, and supporting the establishment of green industries. For example, in Africa, using Africa's critical industries by investing in local processing capabilities, so that they could make the batteries. They don't all have to be made in China or elsewhere. After all, the minerals are going there. And in fact, I think one thing that's common between the Biden administration and the Trump administration is that they've used their commercial diplomacy through the US TDA to persuade African countries not to restrict the export of critical minerals, which is inconsistent with this idea of these countries developing their own manufacturing capacities. And I think, in addition, I would argue that strategies that prioritize debt-free investments, because debt distress is a very important concern, as we've already had.
Sure.
You know, this Anna has already mentioned. There are many other cascading issues, and the tariffs are sort of just one left. I mean, I think I would differ with both, I think, Joel and Simon, you know, with regard to the WTO. I love the Doha Development Agenda. I think that's another really hard fought for agenda in the WTO. I mean, what is the WTO for developing countries without development? And although we know for many reasons that agenda has withered in the WTO, I mean, I don't think that there is any reason to abandon it. And I completely agree on variable geometry. You know, there could be variable speeds for all sorts of things. And if anyone wants a lesson on that, they should look at the African Regional Trading System, can offer multiple lessons, including coalitions of the willing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was good to have a sort of divergent views on this. Anna, let's delve into a little one of the fronts in the tariff front at the moment, which is this de minimis question, which seems trivial to some, but actually it's very important for, you know, your average consumer who you know, buys something online and it gets shipped, and if it's imported from somewhere, it's duty free thus far. It's been so far in the US, but even in the EU, we have this discussion. In the US, the end of it was chaotic. I don't know exactly where the status is. So, and for especially small traders and also developing country traders, you know, to have this opportunity to send small parcels is actually empowering also for not only global companies who can find their way through this tariff maze, but smaller ones less. So I was wondering, can you show us a little bit what impact this tariff war is having? Is it spreading elsewhere as well? And are we going to end up in a more expensive world with many more tariff barriers in the US, but also elsewhere?
Thanks, Yana. I think the minimus is a very interesting sub-question here, and I'll define it in a second because I appreciate not everyone is familiar with the term, but I think it's interesting because it's one of those things happening alongside tariffs, where over the last couple of years we seem to have a bit of a debate between trade facilitation and tightening of controls when it comes to customs, and you can't have both. And at the moment, trade facilitation is losing badly in the last couple of years, which is being obviously felt by companies. So maybe I'll come back to defining de minimis first. So this is something that's been around for many years, and it's basically the minimis comes from a negligible value, something that's not worth collecting tariffs on. This is a provision whereby under a certain threshold, tariffs and occasionally VAT, depending how it's done, is not being collected, and goods below that value are also not subject to full customs formalities. So for example, in the US, you didn't have to submit a full customs declaration, which obviously is time consuming and someone has to do it and someone has to pay for it. So there's also a cost there, but you just needed a manifested transport document, and these goods came in a simpler fashion, plus there was no duty collected for it. And the whole origin of the minimus provision was just because with some of these goods, if you have a parcel of I don't know, $10, $100, the cost of collecting duties and the cost of doing the admin work, both for the state, so the customs authorities, but also for the entire industry, so the customs broker and so on, carriers and so on, there's more cost than there's benefit of the actual customs duties being collected. So that's why we have it in place. And you mentioned this, and that was a very good point, Jana, because you mentioned this as impact on SMEs and so on. The minimus is actually a trade facilitation measure, and it's part of the trade facilitation WTO agreement. It's encouraged by the agreement, so any signatory party of that agreement is encouraged to have the minimus provision. And at the moment, it's quite interesting to see, because you have developing and least developed countries trying to put in a de minimis provision to meet their WTO trade facilitation agreement obligations, and developing countries trying to scale it back or remove it. So this is a very strange situation we find ourselves in. But at the same time, we do understand why we're having this challenge. So in the US, the work on removing de minimis, just like in the EU, started way before Trump. In the EU, we've been talking about this for about a year and a half, probably earlier, but it's part of the customs reform package. In the US, the work started way before as well. But what Trump did was to try to remove it overnight, which obviously didn't work, because there's a lot of extra data that you need to collect, and then had to walk that back. And now it's removed for China, goods from China and Hong Kong. This is, it's a difficult provision, because on one hand you do have SMEs and impact on SMEs. It's not just the consumers, it's also small businesses, both import under the minimis, so companies that use, and there were some on Instagram and TikTok, there were some stories of a cookie producer in New York that uses plastic envelopes, plastic little pouches to pack the cookies individually, and those little things, those little envelopes come from China. So it impacts really small businesses as well as medium-sized businesses and so on. But it's also a trade facilitation measure for the exporter in the third country. So if you are a small provider in a developing country or even in the developed country, exporting under the minimis makes your products a little bit more competitive. So there is definitely this impact on SMEs, but at the same time, the volumes of those parcels, it's just, this is just, as they say, a tsunami of small parcels. In the US, we have about 4 million a day, most of it from China. In the EU, we have about 12 million parcels a day, most of it coming through 1 or 2 ports and entry points. And these numbers in the EU, they double every year. In the US, they double every 2 years. So if you think of a customs official in a warehouse full of small parcels with a notepad or an iPad at best, trying to control what's in that, how much of it is actually the right value, how much of it is split on purpose to avoid taxes, how much of it contains drugs or illicit goods, and so on. It's a bit of a difficult task. So this is kind of where we are. I think maybe I'll kind of keep this short, but we can come back to this in the Q&A session. It's, from what I'm hearing, so the minimus in the US for parcels from China and Hong Kong was removed on the 2nd of May, so it's only been a few days. From what I'm hearing, it's going fine compared to the previous occasion. I think that was in March, where there was an attempt to remove it and everything collapsed because there was no ability to collect data, especially by the post office. But obviously we are seeing and we are reading about the kind of projected drop in terms of air cargo volumes, and the fact that this capacity needs to be redirected. So there's capacity in terms of goods, but there's also additional capacity that needs to be redirected when it comes to those flights. And that's quite a lot of, it's quite a big shift, so that there's potential that this can be, the kind of the airlines understand that it can be up to 40% down in the next few months or weeks and so on. So it's quite a lot of impact. And on consumers as well, we know that Temu in the US decided to, instead of selling from China, sell goods from the US only. So I think consumers will start seeing this sooner or later. There's also an issue around transparency. Do we want in the US to put those tariffs in a separate line, like Amazon mentioned to someone they might do, and what happened with that? Do we want to show consumers just how helpful these tariffs are or not? But so it's a big topic. In the EU, we're also struggling with this, and we're going to discuss it for the foreseeable future. Something needs to be done, but I think the removal of the minimus doesn't necessarily tick all the boxes when it comes to the problem statement. It doesn't solve the problem, which is why it's such a controversial measure. But I'll stop here for now. Maybe we can come back in the questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, because this highlights how concrete this can be in real life for some people, not in the abstract. We have about 22 minutes left now for questions and discussions. We have 7 questions that have come in here already. I see several types of questions. One question specifically, because we've mentioned China, we've mentioned Africa, we mentioned Europe, we mentioned the rest of the world, but India is a big player right now. So maybe Joel or Simon, you want to update us a little bit on where the US-Indian conversation might be? How is India seen in this sort of global tariff war there? The other question is on economic security. I mean, we've mentioned this, Joel started with telling this is emergency. But I mean, we have the impression that this tariff war doesn't necessarily come out of the blue as well. There's been discussions about China as well, the geopolitical impact of China. Even in Europe, we have all these discussions about economic security everywhere, so FDI screening, export controls, all these kind of things. Is this also part of this? Can we make it part of this global trade war or not? How is it impacting everyone? And the other type of question would be, doing a deal with the United States, can it stick? How reliable is the United States now as a trading partner? Who wants to start?
Well, I don't know precisely what's going on with India. I think there are some, maybe Simon or others have more knowledge. I think there are negotiations, and Apple is starting to source iPhones from India, and so it's in some sense it's an opportunity for India. Partly, as you suggest, Jana, because India, at least until yesterday, didn't present the geopolitical concerns that China presents. And you're right, this is linked to disengagement, to cybersecurity, Internet of Things security, restrictions on exports of chips and chip making equipment. That's part of the 62 Act, the Section 232 stuff. And China, for security purposes, to counter that, has restricted exports of rare earths, which are necessary for a lot of high-tech products. So that the trade system, like it or not, we used to say that John Jackson famously said that the trade system was in the boiler room and it wasn't part of high politics, but it's now engaged with high politics. the geopolitical calculus is complicated. I constantly think of Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State during World War II, who imagined the GATT system, imagined free trade as a driver of peace, reflecting on the trade restrictions imposed with respect to Japan as a basis for war, and history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, and I do worry about that issue. Is the United States a reliable partner? No. I mean, look at the USMCA. Trump himself negotiated and crowed about the greatness of that, quote, deal. And now he's ignoring it and saying Canada and Mexico are taking advantage of the United States. We're giving them so much money. It's just confusion, lack of memory, lack of knowledge. So the United States is not reliable. I think the trade system will need greater reliability going forward, and that's a challenge for international lawyers and negotiators to construct systems that don't depend on kind of a natural equilibrium, but have some greater teeth. Thank you.
Yeah, we will see as long as this rivalry, plays out between the U.S. and China. Sort of different hegemonic systems there. We'll see. Simon, is there something you wanted to add to this conversation here?
Sure. I have no further intelligence on India, I have to say, to my great shame, probably. I want to take on two questions that came in. One was about Article 21 of the GATT on national security, and in general, sort of the end of the silos of trade and national security, and how economic security is national security, and so forth. I mean, ultimately, that's more a legal question than an economic question. But the thing is, if economic security is national security and everything is national security, nothing is national security anymore. It is in a way, resort to Article 21, national security, is in a way the end of the rules-based trading system, because once you resort to that, it's kind of game over. I mean, there has been some guidance in WTO cases. Russia Transit being one, but countries have been extremely recalcitrant to resort to Article 21. And as so many things with having to do with mores and tradition, they're now kind of gone out of the window, and that is a big problem for the system and for the stability of the system. There will need to be, if we continue with the rules-based trading order, which by God, I hope we do, we will have to find ways of redefining and putting guardrails on how to use national security, and it's going to be a very tough one. The second one I'd like to take on is from Mark on the question of sort of how is the tariff war affecting FDI trends and whether there's investment diversion. An excellent question, to which I have no full answer, but I just thinking about that. I think we have to probably distinguish between the quality and the quantity of FDI. What I think is going to happen is that the U.S. is the largest external outward FDI country, and as well as the largest inward FDI target. So I think what's going to happen is some of the U.S. FDI is going to be rerouted into domestic investment. I do think that that there is going to be fewer inward FDI into the United States. And when we think about quality and quantity, I think what's going to happen is that the inward FDI into the US is something like, call it tariff jumping. It's essentially building transplants of existing plants that have built somewhere else into the US in order to be able to say it's made in the US and you avoid tariffs. But in terms of the quality of that, I don't think the innovation hubs necessarily are going to move into the United States over short or long. And I do think that in terms of FDI quantity, there is going to be some rerouting to other countries that have been attractive in the past. Doesn't need to be the US. This is for those exporters who don't necessarily need the US as the export market, and that don't need to sort of transplant their engage in the tariff jumping, I guess.
Okay. Thank you very much for jumping in onto this question with very precise answers. There's a question also on the broader geopolitical goals that are pursued through the tariff lens. If the goal is broader than trade, sort of a geopolitical realigning, stopping countries to trade with China or whatever, would tariff imposition be a good strategy, or does that make no sense in terms of cost benefit analysis? Maybe James, you want to pick that up first, and others jump in.
I'm not sure that I can fully answer that, but I do have some thoughts, if you may, on some of the other thoughts on some of the.
You talked about Kenya going to China while the US wanted to visit. So,
Yeah, I mean,
very concrete example here.
Yeah,
but
I'm not sure, that tariffs are going to meet all these goals. I mean, it's also not clear, obviously, as everybody, I think, has alluded to what the goals of the administration are. But clearly, I think the geopolitical context forms part of the backdrop, but doesn't explain everything. I just wanted to weigh in on there's a question about the FTAs, US policy in relation to FTAs. I think Joel has already said a lot about that. I don't want to add more, except to say also, it's also very unclear, based on the gazillion justifications advanced for the tariffs, what the exact justifications are, or if there's really even a rational basis for them, given some of the math that was used initially to justify the tariffs obviously didn't make any sense at all. But I think what's interesting, that we haven't discussed so far, is that there are some constituencies in the US who have actually been supportive of the tariffs. Some trade unions, but also what I would call the trade left in the US. And, trade left, especially exemplified by people like Lori Wallach, who's been sort of in the trenches of trade wars here in the US for many decades. And for this trade left, they have argued that these tariffs should be embraced because they should be part of a larger industrial policy to complement that they should complement a larger industrial policy, very much along the lines of the Biden administration with the CHIPS Act, which obviously wanted to expand semiconductor manufacturing here and prohibited recipients from offshoring manufacture of semiconductors outside the US, and in fact dubbed that as sort of a national security risk. And so this idea of sort of building American national resilience and security through manufacturing capacity is not just something that is shared by the Trump administration, but some on the trade left. And I think I think that should be quite clear. And I think the other thing is the continuity between Biden and Trump. Biden kept most of Trump 1 tariffs, I think, as Joel already said at the beginning, and in fact enhanced them last year. But another thing that I think this policy abandons is the commitment that the Biden administration had to catalyze investments in things like clean energy investments, which I think have been abandoned for other reasons beyond the trade policy. And I think the other thing that the new policy, whatever that might be, also loses is the focus the Biden administration had on focusing on small producers, and its very intentional focus on minorities. In fact, I had a race initiative in the last office of the USTR. So those are some of the things that I think continuation, but some of the things that are lost in sort of this new policy, whatever we might call it.
Yeah. So thank you for reminding us that, because we have now, everyone has been focused on the news every hour for 3 months on trade, but it looks like this will be the US more protectionist term seems to be something that will be lasting, whichever party is in power. There are obviously differences in the approach then to allies and things like that. But on the trade itself, indeed, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And it's maybe something we might want to take away. I mean, beyond the hot news, what is going to stay from this I think that was a very good point to raise here. Anna, you wanted to jump in? Yeah, Joe.
I mean, that perspective depends on whether there's an adverse reaction to this initiative from the Trump administration. It could be. So there's no reason for any optimism at all at this moment, but an optimistic perspective would be that we stare into the abyss and we back away from protectionism. And, maybe just one thought on the trade left, as James describes it. It's unfortunate to see the left in the United States taking a position that, and they have in the past, that is antithetical to the interests of poor people in other countries. So there's just something unfortunate about that particular left perspective. Thank you.
Anna, you wanted to chip in? I mean, there's a question that might be for you, but it's so technical on, commercial invoice on shipments inbound to the, maybe that we will not answer that in the panel. Maybe you won't want to pick that up later, but go ahead. You wanted to add some comments, and I will ask that question to you, but then I'll ask it to the other panelists, maybe to Simon. If we go into the scenario that, this might be lasting unless a big shift happens in the US, are we entering a world of more trade attrition, less growth? How does that, what kind of economic world are we entering, and with the political consequences going with less growth?
Okay, I'll try to keep this brief. So what I wanted to mention about, it was just to the previous question about, the broader effect of these tariffs and geopolitical realigning. I think I do have some, it's not optimism, but I do have some hope for the response. So one thing that we talked about was the reaction of the African continent. And James was talking about this, and there are increasing voices or signals from the continent that there is, that the work on the Continental Free Trade Agreement and boosting the trade within Africa, between African countries, is gaining new momentum, which is very much needed. And my hope is that this will be one of the results of this turmoil at the moment. The other thing that we talked about, and I'm very sorry, I can't remember who mentioned this, but someone did mention this. And there was an article 2 days ago in the FT by Peter Foster with a quote from Cecilia Malmström, and our colleague Ignacio Barcero is also working on this cooperation between EU and CPTPP. This is something that I feel like a couple months ago, before Trump, we would not be taking seriously as a conversation. This is not something we would be writing papers on. And that's part of the reaction. And it's not even, there is an idea of, yes, cooperation, closer alignment, and so on. But there's serious proposals about the second version of this cooperation that includes some sort of market access provisions, some sort of rules of origin accumulation, and so on. Again, I feel like this is a reaction to those tariffs that would otherwise not be possible a few months ago. So we're already seeing some sort of realignment, completely opposite to what the Trump administration wanted this to look like. And hopefully we'll see more of this in that direction, where the rest of the world comes together in defense of the kind of rule-based trade and increases trade amongst themselves. Just very quickly on the question from Greg. I can see the question, Greg is a fellow customs person, hence the technical language, but it's a very good question, which I'll translate into, and this is around the parcels, but also around bigger shipments. you don't, how, if you are at the moment importing parcels into the US, and this is a question I get from companies all the time, and they're originating in China, how will customs officials know if you transship it somewhere else? So if you send it to the UK and then you send it to the US, or if you send it to Vietnam and you send it to the US, basically what I think the question is aiming at is that there's still a lot of loopholes around this. And all these new tariffs also require quite a lot of enforcement with a department of the customs office that's already a bit stretched. So this is a very big topic that's not for now, but it's coming in the next few months. So how do we actually enforce all these policy measures that we've applied at the same time that are quite complex and rely on suppliers providing information that they do not have? So that's for the next webinar, is the compliance and level of implementation.
Simon, less growth out of this, less trade or other type of trade, growth elsewhere? I don't know. What do you think?
I'll try to keep it short to give others the floor as well. So history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. It does help to look at the effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 1930s. Knowing that the world is way more integrated right now than it used to be. So this tells you a little bit of what could happen. James mentioned, and we've all heard this, that the US is only 13% of world trade. I think that figure hides the fact how really central the US is, how central in the financial system it is, and as a foreign direct investment target and an originator. So I think without the US, this is going to be very, very tough. And obviously, it depends on the reaction of the other countries. Are they going to get the act together? Is there going to be a coalition of the willing that really want to follow a rules-based international order to really have a counterweight? Is it going to be with China? Is it going to be without China? Is there going to be 2 trade blocks? Is there going to be 3 trade blocks? All of it really matters. But I mean, as much as we know that trade is good for everyone, we know that lower trade is not good is worse for everyone. That I can tell you. The dimensions and the extent of which we'll have to see. But it's not gonna be better.
Okay. Anna, do you already see some companies just stopping trading results as a real result of this? Or maybe your Brexit experience can also shed a light on that?
Please, let's not bring Brexit into this. It's difficult enough. Definitely on the small parcels, that's definitely, we're feeling this sense at the moment. I think one thing that we are seeing is the reliance on perhaps different supply routes. So I do hear from a lot of companies that are shipping to Canada. I'm not sure, again, this is anecdotal evidence. I'm not sure how that measures, but there is this kind of sense in the industry. What I'm seeing is that the wait and see approach of let's see if we can maybe put it in a warehouse somewhere, if we can temporarily ship somewhere else, if we can do something for now, and it will sort itself out, which I'm not sure is a good strategy, but I've not seen companies seriously consider let's permanently change our supply chains because of these tariffs yet, because it's too volatile for that.
Very good. We've reached the end now. Maybe I'll let all of you, 15 seconds or whatever. Do you see any silver lining out of all of this chaos and uncertainty? And Joel?
Other than never waste a good crisis, it's hard to see anything. I just saw an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where Amy Chan argued that this is all good for the environment, less production, and it's an ugly way to improve our environment, but maybe it's a start. And Trump himself has been kind of arguing against consumerism, saying in his inimitable way, girls need fewer dolls. So there might be something that is a silver lining. It also may be a silver lining. We are starting to think about a world where the United States is not the leader, the hegemonic leader. And other countries will rise up and realize that they have agency and capacity that is important. And so it may, we may be turning to a more healthy system if we survive this.
Thank you very much. James, do you see a silver lining? You're muted. Yeah, no longer.
So I think I largely agree with Joel. I think if the world is going to move towards era in which the US is no longer the indispensable guarantor of stability in the global trading system, but even beyond the global trading system, the international economic system, that is perhaps a good thing. I mean, I think it leaves two paths. You know, one path would be perhaps the US is replaced by you know, a combination of countries that have the same destructive tendencies of the multilateral system, or maybe it leaves room for creating a new and better system. So I think the fact that it opens, I mean, countries now have become much more intentional in sort of thinking about the longer term. I think it's a good thing, but also poses various risks.
New vistas. Simon.
As a staunch European, my hope is that the EU sees it as a wake-up call to be stronger together and to get their act together. Maybe this is wishful thinking, but they definitely have it in them.
Okay. Anna.
I already mentioned mine, so it's the cooperation and working together between other regions, and anything that helps companies be compliant and understand their supply chains is always a win. So that's a little silver lining there.
Okay, thank you very much. So we went 4 minutes over time. I think it's manageable. Thank you everyone for staying on. I'm sorry if some questions were not directly answered. Please reach out to the panelists if you can. So let's wrap this up. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have this conversation. I hope we will meet again online or in person. And yeah, wishing us all the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.